So recently I was doom scrolling on Instagram and this crazy rug table where a rug is encapsulated in epoxy popped up in my feed. It looks like it's gone pretty viral. And if you followed my renovation series, you probably know that I love Persian rugs. I've got them all over the house. So this is one of those things I thought I just got to try this, see if I could figure out how to recreate this table. So I went out, ordered myself a rug. We're gonna give this one a go. So we gotta build a form that we're just gonna drape the rug over. I've modeled up the skeleton of the form here in Fusion 360. So next up, head downstairs, cut that out on the CNC. We got all the pieces cut for the form, and I'm gonna get this up and take it over to the assembly table. By the way, all these holes in here, those are basically just to reduce the weight of the form, no other reason. So a little issue here, I was planning to just use some bendy ply to go over this, but I think we're kind of at the limits. Limits of bendy ply there. Maybe we can just leave it open on that curve and this will be enough that it can kind of drape and have a cool shape as it goes over the corner. Might work okay. Honestly, I think that's gonna be fine.
And one note here, having those rounded corners open will be fine for this step where we're just saturating the rug in resin and draping it over the form. And the later step where we do a full epoxy pour to encapsulate the rug in about an inch of resin, we'll need to figure out something to fill those holes at the rounded corners, but we'll deal with that when we get there.
So I think the last thing we need to do before we soak this rug in resin is just give it a vacuum, make sure it doesn't have lint or debris in it. What makes sense to me is to use some really runny, less viscous resin and kind of rub it in to the rug so the rug gets kind of saturated with it. Then drape the rug over the form so you kind of get the rug hardened. And then once the rug hardens in the shape we want, then we'll kind of complete the form and pour the rest of the resin on top of all that. I think we'll start with the bottom and try to soak that first. Ooh. Okay. Oh yeah, we may have way too much resin. It seems like it's, I don't know, soaking in pretty good.
As I dumped resin onto this perfectly good rug, it occurred to me just what a bizarre project this is. If I hadn't seen this project on Instagram, I highly doubt I would have been trying it. And with all the downsides of social media that we talk about and that I definitely do acknowledge, it is such an amazing source of inspiration for creativity, and it just accelerates the transfer of ideas between creative people. And I just wanted to kind of focus on this little positive side of social media since it doesn't get much positive press these days. And well, it's the holidays, so I like to try to focus on positive things.
Like a little curvature, but try to get this as flat as we can. Now I guess we just let this sit for a couple days and dry out, and then hopefully we'll come back and it'll be like a solid, pretty solid rug. We hope.
Now clearly this plywood shell won't work for a resin pour because resin will stick to plywood and the resin would go through all those openings. So first thing I did was replace the plywood top sheets with pieces of PVC wall panel, which is waterproof. With the PVC panel screwed in place, I then went back with stucco tape to cover all the screws so the water wouldn't escape through screw holes.
So right now I'm waiting on the shipment of Total Boat Fathom resin to show up. It should be here tomorrow. And with the extra time, I got to thinking about the form and decided that this would be a fun application for 3D printing. I designed some rounded corner pieces in Fusion 360.
And since the gaps in the form were wider than I could print on my 3D printer, each of the curved support pieces had to be printed in 2 halves, super glued together, and then I could screw them into the form. I then put some curved 3D printed pieces, I don't know, we'll call them cover plates, on top of those braces, so the curved corners were flush with those PVC panels. The seams could then be siliconed and covered in more stucco tape to hopefully waterproof them. Now, as I'm attaching the sides of the form here with silicone, I'm curious if any of you can spot the fatal design flaw I just made. This is essentially like building an upside down U-shaped aquarium. It needs to be waterproof or the resin will find its way out. And as you'll see in a minute, the way I constructed this was kind of doomed to failure.
The form is all assembled, but I am probably more nervous about leaks in this form than any epoxy form I've ever done before. I couldn't really think of a way to get in and caulk the corners. I just had to put the bead around the outside edges here of the MDF and then just smash those together. That makes me nervous, particularly this seam under here that I'm worried about. What I'm gonna do before I dump a bunch of expensive resin in there is just do a water test, because if it holds water, it'll hold resins. Please don't go through.
Oh my God.
Really? Well, at least we found out before we started going. Yeah, that one is a pretty significant leak.
I mean, we could take all this off and try to redo the silicone. Probably not the best route. I mean, maybe that is the best route. I don't know.
I've got the form mostly rebuilt here, and I did two things to stop the leaks. So the first thing I did was I was thinking about it. I noticed that the screw heads were kind of cutting through the tape. So I stapled all these PVC panels in place, then removed all the screws, plugged all the screw holes with silicone the staples as well, and then covered all the staples with tape. And I think that will greatly reduce the risk of leaks. However, that was not what caused the leak last time. When the sides were flush against the side of the bottom, and the water can get into the MDF, which is porous, and then channel through the MDF around the silicone seals. I don't know that resin would have done that, but I don't want to throw expensive resin away and take a chance. So instead I built it like you see here. There's no chance of it going downward into the MDF and around the silicone. Almost ready for the epoxy pour. One more challenge with this crazy deep vertical form is going to be getting form release on the sides. You need to wipe it on with a microfiber cloth, and my hand just doesn't get down in there. Easy solution, gaffer tape a microfiber cloth to a dowel. It's gonna go down in there nicely so we can get form release all over this. Okay, all right, let's. I think the form is ready. I'm feeling about as confident as I can be, but just in case we get a leak, I've only mixed up about a half gallon of epoxy here. For the first batch, we're gonna dump that in and just pray for me that it holds. But if it doesn't, then worst case scenario is that we have half gallon of resin to try to clean up from the floor as opposed to 3 gallons or more. So we're gonna put this in and let it sit for a little bit, and then we'll dump the rest in. All right, so far so good. We're gonna let it sit for like another 20 minutes just to make sure. Then we'll come back, dump the rest of the resin in to fill up the sides. It is all good. We got no leaks. We're gonna mix up a big old batch, 3 gallons of resin, start this whole pour process. I think it needs just a little more thickness on top, so we're gonna mix up not a full 3 gallon batch, just one more gallon. Should bring it to about 1 inch total thick of epoxy on top. We've let this thing demold for about a week, made sure it's got nice and hard. There is one issue here. Unfortunately, we had some unexpected events about a week ago. So a car somehow veered off the road, ran into the building, In the middle of the night, I was woken up in the commotion of trying to figure out what the heck was going on. I somehow knocked the plastic into the resin. And basically when I pulled it out, it created a bunch of bubbles. Most of those bubbles have come to the surface, so I'm hopeful that with a little elbow grease, we can sand or grind out those bubbles. First things first though, we gotta get it out of the form, hope this thing will pop out smoothly. And there is all the resin that was pulled out when this thing dropped in there.
So at this point, I ran into an unexpected issue. The form was just stuck to the resin. And it was just that PVC wall panel that was sticking to it. Since the bottom of the form wouldn't release cleanly from the resin, I ended up basically having to destroy it, break in some of the wood pieces, and smashing up the 3D printed parts to pull them out. And when I finally pulled the PVC wall panel away, there were chunks of it just left stuck to the resin. I ended up having to take a heat gun and chisel to painstakingly remove all those bits that were stuck.
Man, I went all the way through the rug fabric.
Well, that proved to be a little challenging to remove. Looking at it, it seems just like there were sort of small cracks that some of the epoxy could seep into in that wall panel. So if I ever use that for resin again, need to make sure that we just cover the whole thing in tape. And like I said, the appearance of this doesn't matter because we are going to cover it, but what we do need is for it to be pretty much flat. There's a bunch of air bubbles that got kind of trapped under the rug. Some of them are open here. There's a few at the end where the air bubbles are actually trapped under the resin, so I drilled some access holes. I'm gonna use some high performance epoxy that sets quicker, fill these voids in, and we'll let that sit overnight, and then we can come back, cover this with something more attractive, which we will pick out momentarily.
Went out and picked up a red fabric, which I think should complement the rug color nicely. I took epoxy to the underside just to make it look a little cleaner down there. I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to working with fabric. In the words of my friend Johnny Builds, we're gonna wing it, try to get this to size and then figure out some way to adhere it with resin. Kind of just try to treat it like a carbon fiber sheet, kind of like working with fiberglass, except fabric. We're just gonna try some of this double-sided carpet tape to hold this in place, see if that will work. Actually, that works pretty well. All right, that was easy. Pretty nice straight line. Should do the trick. Now we'll do the same thing on the other side and then we can take it over to the table.
Applying this fabric to the bottom was totally new to me, so I'm making this up as I go, but I figured I could just do something similar to fiberglass. So I brushed on a layer of resin on the entire bottom of the table, laid the fabric across it, and then used a squeegee to work the resin into the fabric until the fabric was entirely soaked with the resin. I intentionally chose a fairly thin fabric with a bit of a mottled pattern, figuring that if things didn't go perfectly, it would still blend in well because of this pattern. After the resin cured overnight, I trimmed the fabric flush with the bottoms of the legs and then did a flood coat with some tabletop resin to give the bottom a nice crystal clear look that should match the top.
All right, this is all cured pretty darn nicely. So we're gonna flip this puppy over and get it all cleaned up in shape before we do our final resin pour on top.
I think it's pretty flat.
Flat, yes, but we still had to address all those bubbles created when I dropped the plastic sheet into the resin, and I'd heated them up as much as I could while the resin was still jello-y, so most of them had risen to the surface, and my thought was to sand them down enough so that I could at least open them up and turn the bubbles into pinholes that could then be filled with a flood coat of tabletop resin.
So I think we're gonna be able to get it. As I'm sanding, I can see all the little white specks. That basically means we've opened it, filling with dust, and then, yeah, you blow it out. You can see all the little pinholes open. Those will fill with tabletop resin when we do the whole thing.
Next up, it was time to cut the sides off the table to get it to its final dimensions. And for this, I had to get creative in a couple different ways. We ended up moving the table onto the floor and propping it up on its end in order to cut the sides of the opposite end. And then I realized that because the track saw can only cut 45 degrees in one direction, the track saw just wasn't gonna work to cut the 45-degree angles we needed at the top edges. So this is where it got a little bit squirrely. We had to move that whole table, which is probably about 100 pounds, over onto the table saw and then run it through the table saw vertically to cut the 45-degree angles off the ends. And I suppose I could have cut these 45-degree angles in the next step where I'm carving the curved edges of the table, but cutting the chunk off of the table saw definitely reduced the amount of carving, dust, and made the whole thing a lot easier. To round over the corners of the table, I wanted to try using sanders instead of an angle grinder. I knew it would be a bit slower, but I thought it might be manageable. First, I tried my big boy Bosch sander in the aggressive material removal mode, and this worked okay, but I actually found a belt sander worked best to remove the bulk of the material quickly. Then I came back with an orbital sander to kind of smooth the whole shape over. And for freehanding this curve, I was pretty darn happy how that came out.
All right, we're ready for the final resin pour. Just making sure we get everything totally dust free, and we'll mix up the resin, get this thing poured. I'm looking at the way it's setting down. Sometimes I do 2 of these, but I don't think we're gonna need a second one. It's just glass. So very excited. I'll let this cure for probably a couple days before we move it. And one thing I'll need to do here is basically all day, I'm just gonna come back and tend those drips on the bottom side because we already got the resin on the underside. So we don't wanna sand it because then we'd have to put more resin and then you're kind of chasing your tail forever between the bottom and the top. So to avoid that, we're just gonna get the scraper and basically tend these bubbles probably for the next 4 or 5 hours just to make sure we don't get any drips. So I'm in the middle of editing and it was brought to my attention there actually is a YouTube video for the project that I saw on Instagram, but it's only like 28,000 views, a few years old. I guess I just missed it. So we're gonna do kind of a mini maker reaction video here. I think it'll be kind of fun to go through and just see what the differences are and how I did it and they did it.
All right, we'll see what they got. Smooth move, rolling it out. And yep, vacuuming all the lint out. So that would suck to do this whole thing and have bits of lint everywhere. Laser cutting, that's gonna be a powerful laser to go through 1/2-inch plywood there, I think. The laser is on my wish list. All right, so the form construction, let's see if they do this in a simpler way than I did. Okay, so they're using, looks like just like 1/8-inch plywood there. And they're just gonna cover it with tape, I bet. Okay, well the corners here. Yeah, how do they? Okay, so that is like, it's like some sort of plastic sheet, like 1/32 inch acrylic or something. Yeah, it's definitely a little simpler than the whole 3D printing thing, but 3D printing was fun, so I'm not mad that I went through that exercise. Why did they mix the resin up? Oh yeah, they just put it on the form. See, to me, like with it spilling over the sides, for just like the soak coat, what we did seems a little simpler, just laying it out flat, soak it, and then put it over the form. Really doesn't make a difference, but we probably wasted a lot less resin. They look like they're using a crap load of resin for this step. Okay, so it looks like they're using plywood sides instead of melamine. So they're probably gonna have to cover it with tape, I'm assuming. Honestly, like using all that tape, it's kind of a pain and it leaves little ridges that need to be sanded out in resin. And I guess in this one, the bottom doesn't really matter too much, and they just siliconed right onto the edge of the rug itself. I think that leaves like a weird bottom. I mean, the bottom of it's gonna be weird. And they did the form kind of like the way I did it the second time, except they're using plywood wrapped in tape. I like those aluminum buckets that the Russian resin comes in. The resin looks clear there, but then like when I'm looking at it here, it looks kind of yellow. Maybe it's just the color of the rug, but all right, so let's see now the corners. Let's see how they deal with these corners. So I don't think that was in the Instagram video. Dialed in 45, because that's really important for this when you're rough cutting it. Got to make sure it's exactly 45 when you're just gonna assume it's sand it. Wait, oh, and then hold on. Look at this. So this isn't even, so after all that, like showing the 45-degree angle, make sure it's perfect. When they cut it, look at it coming through here. It's clearly way off 45 because you can see this. Let's see how that it's getting so much thinner, like end to end. So I don't know. It doesn't matter in result at all. All right, so yeah, belt sander. So they're doing a similar thing here. It looks like grinding the edges down. So okay, so they're doing something similar. That works surprisingly well with the grinder. I was surprised how well that ended up working. Whoa, what's okay? So they didn't do a flood coat at tabletop. That's interesting. They looks like a varnish. I've never tried that. That honestly, that might be easier than a flood coat at tabletop, or like situations where you don't want a super high build like you get with the tabletop. Cool idea. And they had the rug right against the bottom. I'm not a huge fan. Like you can see up here, in the corner here, you just see the bottom of the rug. It kind of looks nasty. You know, I'm getting a closer look at this now than when I had the Instagram video, but I'm glad that we did that fabric on the bottom. Like I think that definitely adds a nice touch they didn't do here. But this is super cool. Obviously I was inspired by it. So interesting to see all the differences.
So watching that, there was nothing where I was like, God, I was so stupid for doing it the way that I did. By the way, I've been thinking it'd be kind of fun to do some of these reaction style videos to other makers' projects, maybe some of my friends' videos. Do a little complimenting, a little bit of roasting. It could be kind of fun. Thinking of maybe putting it on a second channel, but leave a comment and let me know what you think of like a new genre of like maker reaction videos. So this project was a little bit different because I didn't design it. It was more about reverse engineering something I thought it was cool. If you liked it and want more, or didn't like it, either way, leave a comment, let me know. If you think I've earned it or feel like giving in the holiday spirit, I'd greatly appreciate it if you sub and bell. We're getting close to 1 million subscribers. I'd love to hit that goal in 2025. Happy holidays to all you out there. Much love for being here, following along, supporting the channel. That's it for this time, and I'll see you guys next time.